So please join me in welcoming Marisol to UC Berkeley.
Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you, Michael, for that very generous introduction and for the invitation to be here with you all today. So just a kind of quick thing. So I'm going to be talking about the project that Michael mentioned against Puerto Rico, lessons from the Verano Boricua, which is about the protest in the summer of 2019 that got the governor at the time, Ricardo Rosselló, to step down after 2 weeks of sustained protest. So I'll be kind of talking about some of the main takeaways from that book. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about kind of how I got there. This is my first book, Police, Life and Death, Race, Violence and Resistance in Puerto Rico, which Michael mentioned, and which I just did the math because aging is weird. And I was like, oh my God, this book is turning 5 in April.
It's in kindergarten.
Yes, it's a little slightly older than my own child. And so which is a trip because it kind of came out right before the pandemic. So it's got this weird warped kind of timeline. It doesn't feel like it was that long ago. But so the first book, Policing Life and Death, Race, Violence and Resistance in Puerto Rico, what I traced in that book is the emergence and consolidation of punitive governance in contemporary Puerto Rico. So I'm really interested in a couple of questions, which is one, how the colonial relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States has shifted over time. And especially as the United States has increasingly kind of claimed this notion of Puerto Rico as decolonized after the establishment of the Commonwealth, and that colonial status is more obfuscated through language, through policy. I look at policing as one avenue in which we can see very clearly the ways in which this colonial relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States persists, right? And the ways that policing functions as a form of colonial crisis management, essentially, right? So the ways in which it targets populations that are experiencing displacement and precarity as a effect of the colonial relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States. The other thing that I try to do in that book is really think through also the ways that policing helps us to push past some of the ways that race is spoken about in Puerto Rico that reifies this notion of Puerto Rico as a racial democracy, right? So, the notion that racism is somehow less pernicious in Puerto Rico as opposed to the United States, right? That the United States is kind of the apex of this kind of white supremacist, anti-Black racial order, and the prevalence of racial mixing, especially under Spanish colonialism, led to this kind of more racially tolerant society where everyone is mixed, so no one is racist. And I'm like, that's bullshit, right? And so what I do is actually look at policing as a way to understand how white supremacy is manifested, right? So when we're talking about things like crime, when we're talking about things like public housing, when we're talking about things like poverty, right? What are the ways in which those become signifiers through policing that are about race, right? And so that's what I try to do in the first book. And so as I was working on this first book, I became really interested in kind of the ways in which the colonial relation, by focusing on policing, which is a form of state violence, right, and operates as a form of state violence, I became really interested in my conversations with activists, in my kind of research, in how the colonial relationship produces precarity, right, and how it increases proximity to violence, and those kind of questions around kind of state violence, the ways in which both the U.S. but also local elites produce precarity and violence for all Puerto Ricans, but especially targeting vulnerable populations has been something that's kind of at the forefront of my research. And it's something that really carries through, I think, when I get into it, into this next project that emerged after Policing Life and Death. So I just want to kind of preface it to talk a little bit about kind of like the trajectory of how I came to this research. And I'll dive in. All right, so on January 18th, 2020, Lorenzo Delgado, an investigative blogger, filmed a Facebook Live of himself entering a warehouse filled with pallets of aid supplies in the southern city of Ponce. The supplies have been collecting dust since being delivered to the archipelago in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, which battered Puerto Rico on September 20th, 2017. Delgado had been tipped off to the existence of the warehouse by an anonymous source believed to be a political insider a few days earlier. The tipster told Delgado that while they were loyal to the pro-statehood party and their bosses, the situation in the archipelago made the existence of the abandoned warehouse intolerable. Only a few short miles away, Puerto Ricans were dealing with the effects of a 6.4 magnitude earthquake, which had hit on January 7, 2020, and devastated the main island's southern coast. The quake destroyed homes and left thousands once again sleeping below blue tarps, just as they had following Hurricane Maria. Repeated high magnitude shocks, known as an earthquake swarm, and you know, when you're doing Puerto Rican studies, you learn all kinds of new concepts like earthquake swarm, right? Continued to rock the region and keep residents on edge. Puerto Ricans from less affected areas and the diaspora arranged supply drives and fundraisers in order to get desperately needed supplies to those in hard-hit areas. While expressways were jammed by people caravanning south with their cars filled to the brim with supplies, the government knowingly withheld information about warehouses filled with unused disaster supplies. Delgado's Facebook Live picked up more and more viewers as he showed a vast warehouse filled with water bottles, diapers, baby formula, tarps, batteries, propane, cooking stoves, pots, and other supplies. Soon, people from the nearby area began to arrive at the warehouse to see it for themselves. People started to remove the supplies from the warehouse and show them to the indignant crowd that had gathered. Every item held up to the crowd was an indictment against un gobierno asesino, or murderous government that had knowingly withheld supplies while people suffered and died. The pallets of expired bottles of water in particular were a slap in the face, given that in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, some had been driven to drink from contaminated water sources, with dozens contracting and dying from leptospirosis due to the lack of access to clean water supplies. The crowd took usable supplies out of the warehouse and divided them up to be distributed to those who had lost their homes and were living in the region's makeshift camps. Delgado's live stream that day was just the tip of the iceberg, as the government was eventually forced to admit the existence of other similar warehouses. Almost immediately after the discovery of the warehouse, social media was ablaze with fury at the way that then Governor Wanda Vasquez was handling the earthquake-related disaster. Many felt that she was handling the earthquake recovery efforts in a similar manner to how her predecessor, the disgraced former Governor Ricardo Rosselló, handled Hurricanes Irma and Maria. On social media, the hashtags Gobierno de Mentiras, or Government of Lies, Gobierno Asesino, Murderous Government, and Wanda Renuncia, Wanda Resign, immediately started trending. The last hashtag harkened back to the Ricky Renuncia or Ricky Resign social media campaigns and the massive protests that unseated Ricardo Rosselló only months earlier. Oh, and I forgot I have this like cool poker. Okay, all right, now we're cooking. On January 18, 2020, Twitter user X now, I guess, with the handle Governmental Felix, shared the video from the warehouse on Twitter and said over and over again, "There is no forgiving, they let us die," before concluding, "They kill us." For many, the uncovered warehouse was evidence of the kind of callous disregard and political calculation that caused thousands of preventable deaths in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria. That evening, a protest was convened for our dead outside of La Fortaleza, or the governor's mansion of San Juan, to demand accountability. Calling on abusive government officials to resign, The protest took place during Las Fiestas de la Calle de San Sebastián and replaced the air of revelry in the streets of Old San Juan with one of rage and mourning. Protesters came armed with signs demanding justice for those who had died as a result of Hurricane Maria, as well as those who continue to die as a result of government corruption and neglect. One sign held up by a protester read, "Criminal government, they want us dead." And dead is underlined. I know it's like, might be hard to see on the slide. For the most part, Vasquez denied responsibility for how the government, how the current disaster recovery efforts were being managed, shifting blame onto the previous administration. The irony, of course, was that Vasquez was part of the previous administration as Secretary of the Department of Justice, and many of her advisors and cabinet members were also part of the Rosselló government, and thus implicated in the very corruption and ineptitude from which they were now trying to distance themselves. Repeatedly asserting that it is challenging to receive a government in transition, Vasquez said that she had no plans to step down and would continue to help those most affected by the earthquakes in the South. In many ways, protesters saw ousting Vasquez as the unfinished business from the protests of the Verano Boricua, or the Puerto Rican summer, which lasted from July 11th to July 24th, 2019. Rosselló had been removed from office, but many of the corrupt members of the political elite that made up his cabinet remained in powerful government posts. Fed up with a governor that remained unaccountable and recalcitrant, organizers called for a general stoppage or a paro nacional on January 20th to demand that Vasquez step down along with other corrupt officials. The evening before the paro, protesters gathered outside La Fortaleza with pots and pans and were heard around the San Juan metropolitan area. On the day of the paro, hundreds of protesters gathered in the capital and called on Wanda to step down. In response, the Puerto Rico Police Department, or the PRPD, mobilized a massive number of police from the Tactical Operations Unit known as La Fuerza de Choque, which is kind of like a riot squad. They're like the very heavily armed, you know, with all the black gear and all that stuff. So they were mobilized in order to intimidate protesters and keep the demonstrations under control. As heavily clad riot police filed out of the back gates of La Fortaleza, people noted that there always seemed to be ample government coordination and resources when it was time to call out the police to repress the population, but never when it came time to distribute aid to disaster survivors. Throughout the day, the blue tarp, which had become ubiquitous in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, as FEMA assistance failed to materialize for many who continued to live in what remained of their homes, became a poignant symbol of the government's willingness to let people die. Protesters marched down La Fortaleza, holding a blue tarp above them and chanting, "Sir, madam, don't be indifferent. They hide supplies and they kill people." At various points throughout the day, during the protest, a man wearing a bloody t-shirt would lay on the ground, face down, with arms and legs stretched out, lying very still and surrounded, bless you, by a crowd of onlookers. The performative corpse held onto a Puerto Rican flag in one hand and a blue tarp in the other. Protesters through such performances made clear that the state, in its deception, in its graft, and in its political maneuvering, was responsible for the deaths of thousands and the suffering of many thousands more. The demonstration against the Vasquez administration continued, with protesters coming back to the streets of Old San Juan night after night, just as they had during the Ricky Renuncia protests of the Verano Boricua. The night after the paro, a guillotine made an appearance in front of the governor's mansion. And this was great. In subsequent demonstrations, and it's also, I wanted to say, like, it's a guillotine, but it's also the guillotine that's painted in the black and white flag, which has been the flag, the kind of anti-austerity, anti-colonial flag as well, that emerged after the imposition of the Fiscal Control Board in Puerto Rico, and it has become a symbol of resistance. So the night after the battle, the guillotine made an appearance in front of the governor's mansion. In subsequent demonstrations, protesters could be seen carrying the guillotine down the cobblestone streets, shouting, "Wanda asesina, queremos guillotina." Wanda murderer, we want the guillotine. The reckoning, they alerted, was upon her. Perhaps in response to the increased militancy of the protests represented by the guillotine, police began to behave more aggressively towards the crowd gathered outside of La Fortaleza. stepping up surveillance efforts and indiscriminately using tear gas on peaceful protesters in order to force an end to the event's protests. Protesters also denounced the presence of infiltrators, agent provocateurs, and other police operatives working to destabilize and delegitimize the demonstrations. So this is like, during the demonstrations, there was all of this, just like during the Ricky Renuncia, but during this phase, accusations that protesters were taking the kind of historic cobblestones to throw at police, and protesters would say that's actually the police that are doing those things. After a week, the protests and demonstrations that occupied the streets around the Fortaleza started to wind down, while Vasquez continued to deny responsibility for the mishandling of emergency supplies and the painfully slow recovery efforts in the South. Although many hoped for a sequel to the Verano Boricua and thought that it would only be a matter of time before Juan de Renuncia succeeded, there was no question that many people were exhausted. People were literally sleepless as quakes interrupted their nights and trauma kept them awake and worried about the next disaster. There was also a sense of political exhaustion, a sense that even after the events of the summer, people were still dealing with la misma mierda, or the same shit, which made some reluctant to commit to the time and energy necessary that made Ricky Renuncia possible. Still, others felt that what was needed in order to change the political situation in Puerto Rico was not another round of mass mobilizations such as those that marked the Verano Boricua, but instead long-term grassroots education and organizing. While there were disagreements about the utility or even the possibility of a repetition of the summer, there were lessons from the Verano Boricua that both circulated and resonated in the warehouse demonstrations. So as Wanda Vasquez continued to deny culpability for her role in facilitating the immiseration and premature deaths of Puerto Ricans in the wake of disaster, I heard people say that the response of the governor and her administration showed that she had not learned from the Ricky Renuncia protests and the events of the summer, and that it was up to the people to once again teach them. These comments reveal that we should understand the Verano Boricua as a moment of popular political pedagogy, or a moment when collective political action provides us with lessons about what kind of world we want to live in and the steps we should take to work towards it. So what were the lessons of the Verano Boricua? What does it teach us about the kind of Puerto Rico that Puerto Ricans desire and deserve? The Verano Boricua is important not just because it resulted in the resignation of Ricardo Rosselló, the first time a democratically elected Puerto Rican governor has vacated their post. It's also important because it indexed a political praxis rooted in the idea of truly living in Puerto Rico. That is, living a life of dignity and respect that is free of degradation and violence. In a context where colonial capitalism creates conditions of vulnerability, harm, and death in the lives of many Puerto Ricans, the Verano Boricua drew from a long radical tradition of feminist, queer, anti-racist, anti-capitalist, and anti-colonial organizing in Puerto Rico and its diaspora in order to promote conditions that foster and affirm Puerto Rican life. As literary scholar Christopher Powers has suggested, the Verano Boricua was a radical reweaving of the web of Puerto Rican past, presents, and futures in order to create new temporal possibilities grounded in autonomy and self-determination. The disparate political impulses that nurtured the Verano Boricua were united through their rejection of necropolitical ideologies and practices that shaped the quotidian for many Puerto Ricans. When on July 13, 2019, the Center for Investigative Journalism, or CPI, released 889 pages of messages from a private chat between Rosselló and a number of high-ranking officials sent on the encrypted messenger service Telegram to the public, the leaked chat in many ways provided the spark for the widespread, long-simmering discontent felt by Puerto Ricans to explode. In the chat, Rosselló and his inner circle engaged in all manner of homophobic, transphobic, and misogynistic, what they call locker room talk, calling political opponents putas or whores and mamabichos, cocksuckers, commenting on women's bodies, and insulting feminists and members of the LGBTQ+ community. In one of the most disgusting exchanges in the chat, the brothers, as the participants referred to themselves, made light of the unprocessed bodies that accumulated in the Office of the Medical Examiner following Hurricane Maria. In response to comments made by Rosselló's chief of staff, Ricardo Lirandi, excuse me, Rosselló notes in the chat that they have to work to bury the story. Former chief financial officer and the governor's representative to the Fiscal Oversight Board, Christian Sobrino, then replies, quote, now that we're on the subject, do we not have a corpse to feed our crows? They clearly need attention, end quote. For Puerto Ricans, this wasn't just a crude or distasteful joke. It was proof of the callousness and disdain for the public with which elites govern. While the media, and in particular US-based media, focused on the unprofessional and vulgar nature of the leaked chats, what kicked off the Ricky Renuncia protest for many Puerto Ricans, while the media focused on the unprofessional and vulgar nature of the leaked chats, that kicked off the protest, many Puerto Ricans situated the chats within a broader context of structural violence, degradation, and exploitation that marked contemporary Puerto Rican society. Rather than a singular or unique example, WikiLeaks, as it was called, was indicative of everything that is wrong with governance in Puerto Rico and the deadly consequences that it carries. Puerto Ricans are confronted with constant attacks on their communities, bodies, mental health, and very humanity at the hands of both federal and local officials. The leaked chats painfully showed how the current political formation in Puerto Rico and the economic and political elites who sustain it devalues life and facilitates the death of Puerto Ricans, particularly those who occupy the most vulnerable positions in society. The rhetoric and attitudes of the governor and his closest allies captured in the chat are ones that promote harm and death in myriad ways, from the outright incitement of violence to the promotion of neoliberal politics of deadly neglect. This is something the protesters were clear about from the outset of the protest. During the Verano Boricua, Puerto Ricans were protesting the ways that their lives are devalued and their future circumscribed by both colonial rule and the avarice of local elites. The protests were not just about Rosselló. They were about the political and economic structures of extraction and dispossession that generate profits at the expense of Puerto Ricans' lives, policies that make life in the archipelago increasingly unlivable for many. And this already was something I just want to say very quickly. When I was doing the research for my book, the bulk of which took place in 2011 and 2012, with kind of return trips in 2015 and 16, when I would talk to young people about what they were facing, there was a constant sense of exhaustion with the young people that I spoke to, and a feeling that they were being kind of increasingly shoved out, that Puerto Rico was no longer a place for them, right? Where they felt like what was the purpose of getting a degree so that they could work at Burger King for $7 an hour, right? This sense of a feeling that if you wanted a better life, you had to leave, right? And that was part of a concerted effort and plan. Mm-hmm. And so that kind of feeling was already simmering for almost a decade before these protests even occurred. So now I lost my place. Yes, okay. So protesters were in the streets struggling against the limited horizons offered by local elites, the federal government, and Wall Street vulture capitalists. They were struggling against the efforts to turn the archipelago into a place of endless profit and economic growth for debt vultures, tax evaders, and local elites. They were struggling against efforts to empty the archipelago and create a Puerto Rico without Puerto Ricans. Mm-hmm. Or as Edwin Miranda, one of Rosselló's advisors, joked in the chat, kind of trying to sound like Trump, he said, "I saw the future, it's wonderful, there are no Puerto Ricans." In short, protesters were struggling against debt functioning as a central economic and political logic of the state, Muerto Rico. The phrase Muerto Rico has circulated for many years, particularly among some environmental justice activists who've deployed the phrase to oppose a variety of toxic projects in the archipelago, including Monsanto's genetically modified seeds, incinerators, and attempts to build dangerous natural gas pipelines. The phrase has also been used to refer to the archipelago's high rates of crime and homicide. Building on the concept of Muerto Rico, as it's been taken up by activists and artists, I want to suggest that there are opportunities for rebirth grounded in a politics of life that emerge as Puerto Ricans resist colonial capitalism's attempts to deaden and kill. The events of the Verano Boricua serve to highlight the violence of the colonial state while prefiguring new ways of living in Puerto Rico. The organizing against efforts to transform the archipelago into Muerto Rico that took place during the Verano Boricua offer us a series of lessons to help us think about what a Puerto Rico that is more just and life-affirming might look like and how we might get there. So in the book, and this is just like from the back cover of the book because the publisher was really smart and put my lessons on the back, so I didn't have to type them out. But in the book, I go through what I kind of identify as the 6 most important lessons that I gleaned from the process. I'm actually going to read it off of here because it's so small on here. So the first is the struggle must be intersectional. The second is the criollo elite are a murderous class. The third is debt is death, protest is life. The fourth is protests are sites of pleasure. The fifth is that la policía does not equal el pueblo. And the last is that the diaspora must be part of the struggle for Puerto Rico's future. And so, these are lessons, this list is not meant to be exhaustive and, they're not the order, it does not imply any kind of hierarchy. But for me, as someone who has been researching Puerto Rico, particularly in this moment of deepening austerity, who's very interested in kind of questions of colonialism, someone who identifies as a queer feminist, and someone who is also a diaspora Puerto Rican, right? Who does research in the archipelago, but is mainly located in the diaspora. These were the kind of lessons that really stood out to me. And so today, since we're short on time, I'm just going to talk through 2 of these lessons. The first, that the struggle must be intersectional, and then the fourth, that protests are sites of pleasure. So I'm just going to kind of walk through those. But check out the book. It's very small. It's like bilingual. It's published by this amazing queer feminist independent publisher in Puerto Rico. So check it out. Okay. So the Verano Boricua proves to be one of the most politically and demographically diverse social protests in recent Puerto Rican history. People who participated in the protests, including those who were seasoned veterans of leftist social movements, noted that the streets looked and felt different during the nearly 2 weeks of renuncia protests. Black and dark-skinned Puerto Ricans, queers, women, and poor and working classes that have been historically marginalized from the formal political sphere, as well as certain leftist movements, really were at the forefront of these protests. The Puerto Rican left, in particular the pro-independence and labor movements, have long been dominated by white, male, middle, and upper-class protagonists, which unfortunately replicates some of the most pernicious hierarchies and social values and structures in society. The legacies of mestizaje and the powerful myth of racial democracy in Puerto Rico have resulted in social movements, including those that are concerned with issues of racial, economic, and gender and sexual justice in Puerto Rico, having figureheads that do not often look like the populations most impacted by colonial capitalism. The Verano Boricua, however, bucked that trend, as it was clear that Black, feminist, queer, and working class activists were front and center. Afro-Puerto Rican feminist scholar and activist Barbara Abadia Fesach noted of the protest, quote, "This is a new country," many said. "The great racialized Puerto Rican family protested in the streets without fear," end quote. La gran familia puertorriqueña, or the great Puerto Rican family, or the notion that Puerto Ricans are a harmonious blend of African, indigenous, and Spanish genetics and cultures, has largely functioned as a blunt object used to bludgeon critics of racial discrimination and exclusion. For Abadia Resach and others, the diverse nation de la gran familia puertorriqueña presupposed, however, was made real in the streets during the Verano Boricua. It is important to note, however, that this was not merely about symbolic or visual diversity, but that the issues and concerns of historically marginalized populations were also made central to the protest. This major shift in Puerto Rican political organizing is due to the work of Black, feminist, queer, and anti-colonial activists who have been mobilizing in recent years to respond to the multiple crises confronting the archipelago in deeply intersectional and comparative ways. These organizers have sought to show how the crises created by colonialism, capitalism, sexism, queer antagonism, heteropatriarchy, and racism are fostering harm and death in the lives of Puerto Ricans. The work of these organizers to educate the public about how the current political economic system negatively impacts the lives of Puerto Ricans was instrumental to the incredible cross-section of people that we saw in the streets refusing to accept the political lies such as life. We see this clearly if we look at the organizing work undertaken by feminist and queer activists. In particular, La Colectiva Feminista en Construcción, or La Cole, took a leading role in protest demanding Rosselló's resignation. La Cole, which Aurora Santiago Ortiz defines as an intersectional political organization with an explicitly anti-capitalist, anti-racist, pro-queer, and trans agenda from its inception, is rooted in Black feminist traditions and has been working to address the ways that women and feminine identified people are affected by state and interpersonal violence. Two of their biggest campaigns have revolved around calling for an audit of the debt and an end to austerity, as well as working to end the femicides in Puerto Rico. La Cole, alongside other organizers, connected their rage over the leaked chats to the violence that the state perpetuates and allows every day in the lives of vulnerable Puerto Ricans. Queer and feminist organizers undertook this key organizing work, not because Rosselló and others in the chat referred to women as putas and gatitas, kittens, but because the content of the chats illustrated the refusal of the government to address the urgent problem of gender-based violence in Puerto Rico. Feminist organizers, most visibly La Cole, had been calling on the governor to declare a state of emergency to deal with the high rates of gender-based violence for over a year. In one of their most well-known actions, La Cole camped outside of the Fortaleza in November 2018 as part of a Plantón Feminista, or feminist sit-in, in order to demand the declaration of a state of emergency in response to misogynistic violence. The governor and his administration repeatedly refused to engage with the feminist protesters and used police to violently dislodge them. As Vilma Gonzalez, who joined La Cole's Plantón, said, quote, "He did not come out to ask why we were so concerned, why we were so angry," end quote. While La Cole and other feminist groups were protesting outside the governor's mansion, demanding that the state stop doing nothing while women were killed in Puerto Rico because of sexist violence, the governor and his closest advisors were cracking jokes and dismissing them as a future impact. The governor, when asked about the misogynistic, homophobic, and transphobic language used throughout the chat, said that he was overworked and just blowing off steam. But as feminists in Puerto Rico were quick to note, dozens of women have been killed at the hands of stressed out men who were just blowing off steam. The governor's words were not just profane, as he repeatedly refused to address the high rates of violence that women and queer people confront in Puerto Rico, but they translate into lives lost. As Vanessa Contreras Capó, a spokesperson for La Cole at the time, said, quote, "His attack was not that he called us whores, kittens, or any other macho epithet. The governor's attack is that he has still not declared a state of emergency against gender violence," end quote. Feminists and queer folks were among the first to take to the streets after the chat was released. For them, the chats made evident the disdain and bullying mentality of the Rosselló administration towards marginalized and vulnerable people. As queer writer and activist Georgie Interesari noted, quote, "It was easy to organize ourselves. There was no rest for our anger and outrage. From our place of fighting as LGBTQ+ communities and fighting against the goddamn projects at Rosselló, we became integrated into a larger community, a people united in indignation and rage, but also united in the certainty that this and any government owes us respect, owes us the recognition of our humanity, and owes us the rights that are given and won for all humans," end quote. Feminists and queer activists joined with others in the streets to express their dissatisfaction with the incompetent and cruel men literally killing them with their indifference. Femicides, thousands dead from Hurricane Maria, hundreds dead by their own hands because a future in the archipelago seems impossible, and countless more killed by the effects of austerity. How much more were Puerto Ricans expected to endure? How many more deaths will Puerto Ricans be told to accept? The situation was intolerable, and the protest became a matter of life and death, aimed at not only getting Rosselló and his cronies out of office, but sending a clear message that things could not continue as they had because Puerto Ricans' lives were at stake. According to Contreras Capó, quote, the chat represented the intersectionality of repression, end quote. In other words, the chats revealed the ways that marginalized and vulnerable Puerto Ricans are targeted by an exploitative and repressive elite political class. The interlocking oppressions created, to borrow from the Combahee River Collective, created by the heteropatriarchal, capitalist, racist, and colonial state, is precisely what created a sense of linked fate among a wide cross-section of Puerto Ricans during the summer protests. A deepening understanding of the importance of intersectional organizing is indebted to queer and feminist organizers working in the archipelago, particularly Afro-Puerto Ricans and diaspora Puerto Ricans who have been working to challenge notions around what constitutes protest and who is an appropriate political subject. In particular, as feminist philosopher Rosselló Zambrana points out, La Cole and their collaborators have created a repertoire of tactics that, quote, interrupt common sense about the operation of the state and capital and highlight the differential impact of the necropolitical state along race, gender lines, end quote. The labor of these organizers created a terrain that allowed for the emergence of new political horizons and subjectivities, which were on full display during the Verano Boricua. It's important to remember that it was La Cole, not Bad Bunny, and their collaborators who drew hundreds of thousands to the streets, although we love that Bad Bunny was out there, but it was them that drew hundreds of thousands to the streets on July 22nd, 2019 for a massive general strike to demand Rosselló's resignation. It was the radical intersectional vision of a life-affirming future for Puerto Rico put forward by queer and feminist organizers that resulted in convening people for one of the largest, if not the largest, protests in Puerto Rico's history. As Joan Davila of La Cole told the New York Times, for many years, quote, for many years, we've been demanding for life in Puerto Rico to change. A slogan that we use and that we have in one of our campaigns is, let's build another life. Something that these protests have shown us is that change is in the consciousness of the people, end quote. Hundreds of thousands marched in order to build a new life by not only demanding that the governor step down, but also demanding a radical restructuring of Puerto Rican society through an end to austerity, extraction, and colonial violence. So I'll share the second lesson for today, which is protest or type of pleasure. The day that Rosselló finally stepped down was the day that Perra Mística and Cállate, two queer DJs, convened a perreo combativo, or a combative perreo. And perreo, for folks who don't know, is the dance associated with reggaeton. It's like grinding. Perreo refers to like doggy style. So they convened this perreo combativo on the steps of the Cathedral of San Juan, which is one of the oldest cathedrals in the New World. So to the driving bass of reggaeton beats, young people danced and put their bodies on display, demanding that Ricky resign and take the rest of his corrupt cabinet, as well as the Junta de Control Fiscal, or the Fiscal Control Board, with him. Spilling forth from the steps and onto the street in front of the cathedral, young people engaged in sensual pleasures and camaraderie, dancing, laughing, flirting, showing off. Raunchy lyrics and sweaty bodies mixed the profane with the sacred in an act of political defiance and embodied liberation. Rosselló, it seemed, could withstand 12 days of nonstop protest, pero un perreo intenso was too much. After Rosselló resigned, people on social media jokingly said, el perreo ganó, or perreo won. Si perreo no es revolución, there's no revolution without perreo. These comments were somewhat tongue-in-cheek, given the way that reggaeton music and fans have historically been criminalized and disparaged as low-class and ghetto. It was laughable to many that scantily clad young people, many of whom were women and are queer, could topple a governor and challenge the criollo elite by enjoying their bodies and the bodies of others to the sound of Afro-diasporic rhythms. While some treated it as a joke, the perreo combativo has much to teach us about social justice and liberatory politics in contemporary Puerto Rico. The Verano Boricua, and in particular the perreo combativo, showcased how embodied pleasure should be a vital and necessary component of political protest. As Adrienne Marie Brown argues in Pleasure Activism, The Politics of Feeling Good, We must decolonize our bodies and bring radical movements into alignment with the things that bring us pleasure. Centering pleasure in our social movements is not frivolous. Rather, it allows us to, quote, generate power from the overlapping space of desire and aliveness, tapping into an abundance that has enough attention, liberation, and justice for all of us to have plenty, end quote. An activism rooted in pleasure, one that sees pleasure as central as opposed to a distraction from real political work, according to Adrienne Marie Brown, quote, asserts that we all deserve pleasure and that our social structures must reflect this, end quote. As a society based on racial, sexual, and gender dominance, structured through colonial capitalism and the creation of spaces where oppressed populations can live and experience joy is critical for actualizing a society where all Puerto Ricans are valued in their difference. For young queers and feminists, the Perreo Combativo was about embodying a resistance to state policies and cultural attitudes that want to erase queer and feminine bodies from public space. They do not see them as part of the body politic. There's an obvious lack of government interest in addressing the high rates of femicides and hate crimes that steal the lives of vulnerable Puerto Ricans. The chats made that much clear. Added to that, powerful conservative Christian groups have steadily fought to roll back reproductive rights and public education that integrates perspectives on gender and sexual difference with the support of the local government. So then, what does it mean to revel in bodily pleasures when the state doesn't care if you die? What does it mean to create spaces of camaraderie and joy in a context when women and queer people, particularly those who are racially marginalized, are often only rendered visible in and through the material and symbolic violence enacted against them? Drawing on Argentinian feminist scholar Barbara Sutton, the writer Elian Perez Cruz argues that the Perreo Combativo is an example of how Puerto Rican feminists and queers have put their body on the line in order to build a new future, poner el cuerpo. It is often queer, feminine, and non-conforming bodies, those bodies exposed to tremendous vulnerability, that are most willing to poner el cuerpo because their existence is inherently marked by risk. As Sutton notes, quote, wounded bodies, tortured bodies, defiant bodies, bodies that confront repression, bodies that protest in surprising ways, and out-of-place bodies shape the political landscape and the embodied consciousness of participants, end quote. This is why we saw women and queer people, particularly those who are racially and economically marginalized, take a leading role in the Verano Boricua. Their bodies have long been under attack, and they've had no choice but to put their bodies on the line in order to fight for a more life-affirming future. This is also why the Perreo Combativo functioned as a powerful space for enacting bodily freedom in the here and now, challenging the necropolitical violence of colonial capitalism that structures life for vulnerable populations. The Perreo Combativo was a space that celebrated life and called into being a future where pleasure, joy, and togetherness structure social relations, a future of abundant life. Protests then must function as spaces that centralize a politics of pleasure, as well as spaces that are pleasurable in and of themselves. Many of the protests that marked the Verano Boricua, the Perreo Combativo included, utilized practices associated with pleasure and leisure. During the protests, we saw people riding bicycles, dancing, singing, playing music instruments, doing yoga, kayaking, running, riding horses, and making art in order to demand political change. The protest created a space of solidarity and sociality that brought people together through a shared political agenda while providing connections grounded in pleasure and joy. This is key given the intense segregation that marks Puerto Rican society. The protests allow for social contact and shared pleasures that are made increasingly difficult by the formal and informal barriers that carve up the physical landscape throughout the archipelago. In the space of the protest, you didn't need to deal with the frustrating lack of public transportation or the prevalence of controlled access gated communities or the constant surveillance of police patrols or any of the other mechanisms designed to keep Puerto Ricans stuck in place and apart from one another. During the protest, Puerto Ricans formed and sustained communities that would help them to confront the everyday violence of the state and criollo elite and work towards just and more pleasurable conditions of life. Thank you.